3 years and 8 months. That's how long two people spent behind bars for beating a man to death with a baseball bat and a brick. It started with a call to 911, made from the house where he died.
He's bleeding all over, and I may have killed him.
Was he drinking?
Yes, he had been drinking during the course of the day.
My partner's dispatching the ambulance and the officer while I get the information.
Okay.
Not once does his voice shake on that call. Not once does he ask if the man is going to live. When paramedics step inside, the house doesn't look like the scene of a struggle. Blood marks the walls. It's spread across the bathroom floor. The room where it happened is silent now, except for the people standing in it. The man on the floor will not survive. The man who made that call doesn't have a scratch on him. Neither does his daughter. A man dead. A call that sounds nothing like an emergency, and not one mark on either of them to show what they say happened before any of this happened. Jason Corbett was simply a man building an ordinary life in Limerick, Ireland. He managed operations at a packaging company, a steady job he'd held for years and was good at. He was married to Margaret Fitzpatrick, known to everyone as Mags. Together they had 2 children, Jack and Sarah, born 2 years apart. In November 2006, a few months after Sarah's birth, that life broke apart without warning. Mags suffered a severe asthma attack at home one evening. Her sister Catherine was staying with them that night and saw her reach urgently for her inhaler. Jason got her into the car himself and drove toward University Hospital Limerick, but she didn't survive the trip. She was gone before they arrived. Jason was 30 years old. He now had a toddler and an infant, and no partner left to raise them with. He didn't send the children away to be raised by relatives, and he didn't disappear into his own grief either. He kept the household running himself. Work in the mornings, the children in the evenings, the same routine day after day. People who knew him at the time describe a man who simply absorbed the loss and kept functioning because 2 small kids needed him to. By 2008, raising 2 young children alone while working full-time had become unsustainable without help. Jason placed an advertisement for a live-in au pair. The woman who answered it was 24 years old, from Knoxville, Tennessee, newly arrived in Ireland with no prior connection to the family. Her name was Molly Martins. Family friend Lynn Shanahan remembers meeting her the day she landed at the airport. Her first impression wasn't one of reassurance. She later said, plainly and without hesitation, that this wasn't what Jason needed at that point in his life. Molly moved in anyway. For a while, things appeared to settle. She cared for Jack and Sarah daily. Jason went back to focusing on work. From the outside, it looked like a grieving family slowly finding its footing again. Nobody watching that arrangement in 2008 had any reason to suspect where it would eventually lead. By 2010, the relationship between Jason Corbett and Molly Martins had moved from professional to romantic. They married in 2011 and relocated the entire family to North Carolina, where Jason had transferred for work. He bought a house in a quiet neighborhood, paying for it with the proceeds from selling his home in Limerick, along with his own savings. He gave Molly $80,000 to furnish it, along with a new BMW. He also gave his new father-in-law, Thomas Martins, $49,000 toward the wedding itself. From the outside, it looked like generosity. Underneath it, a more complicated picture was already forming. A former colleague of Thomas Martins later said he had openly disclosed his dislike of his son-in-law well before the marriage even took place. Thomas had spent 30 years as a federal agent, and according to that colleague, he made no secret of how he felt about the man his daughter had married. There were other pressures building inside the marriage itself. Jason and Molly had reportedly tried for years to have a child of their own. He spent $25,000 on fertility treatment that never resulted in a pregnancy. A neighbor, Billie June Jacobs, later said Molly had described several miscarriages to her over that same period. Jason's brother, John, said publicly that one source of ongoing friction was the legal status of Jack and Sarah. Molly reportedly wanted to formally adopt them. Jason chose a different path. He processed green cards for his children through his own employer rather than through Molly's family. A decision John said was deliberate, made out of concern that the children might not be returned to Ireland if anything ever happened to him. Court records later surfaced that added weight to that concern. In 2013, 2 years into the marriage, Molly consulted a lawyer about her custody rights to the children in the event of a divorce. She returned to a lawyer again in 2014. Jason's sister, Tracy Lynch, later alleged a specific incident involving Jack, that Molly had held the boy's face under a running kitchen faucet as punishment. It's one allegation among several she would go on to raise about how the children were treated in that household. None of this erases the other side of the picture. Molly's own uncle, Mike Ernest, described her as genuinely good with children, someone who showed real warmth toward Jack and Sarah day to day. The people around this marriage didn't see one version of Molly Martins. They saw several, often contradicting each other. What's harder to explain away is the money. A $600,000 life insurance policy existed on Jason's life, with Molly as the beneficiary. Combined with the custody consultations and the adoption dispute, a financial and legal motive was already on paper, years before anyone died. If you want every dollar and every document in this case laid out properly, instead of skipped over for the more dramatic parts of the story, subscribe. That's exactly what this channel is built to do. On the afternoon of Saturday, August 1st, 2015, Thomas and Sharon Martins made a sudden decision. They got in the car and drove nearly 5 hours from their home in Tennessee to North Carolina, arriving at Jason and Molly's house that evening. They settled into the guest room downstairs. Nothing about the visit was announced in advance. Phone records pulled later by investigators showed a pattern, building hours before they even left. Thomas called Molly early that afternoon. 15 minutes after that, he called Jason directly. Jason didn't pick up. Thomas called again and again. 4 calls in total, none of them answered. On the last one, he left a message lasting just over half a minute. Around the same time, Molly had a separate call with her mother, Sharon, right as the family's dinner plans for that evening abruptly changed. Investigators would later treat that shift in plans, paired with the unanswered calls, as a detail worth examining closely. By nightfall, Thomas and Sharon were settled into the house, and the evening passed without anything unusual reported by anyone present. Hours later, at 3 in the morning, Thomas called 911. This time, knowing what came before, the call sounds different. He told the dispatcher his son-in-law had attacked his daughter, and that he'd stepped in to stop it. He said Jason had grabbed a baseball bat, one Thomas claimed he'd brought along as a gift for his step-grandson. He said he struck Jason with it. Molly told police she then hit Jason with a paving brick that had been sitting on her nightstand. Her explanation for why it was there at all was that she and the children had planned to paint it for a project near the mailbox. When officers and paramedics moved through the house, they documented something that didn't match the account they'd just been given. Jason had suffered fatal injuries. Neither Thomas nor Molly had a single visible injury on them. Not a bruise, not a scratch. Both told detectives they had fought for their lives against a man who outweighed them and was actively trying to kill them. For 2 people describing a violent fight on those terms, that absence stood out to investigators almost immediately. A struggle severe enough to end in death should leave some mark on the people who survived it. It left none. Not on the man who said he swung a bat repeatedly, and not on the daughter who said she feared for her life beside him. That gap between the story they told and the evidence in front of investigators is where this case actually begins. Former Davidson County Sheriff David Grice arrived at the house that morning before the sun was fully up. He'd worked homicide scenes for years, and something about this one didn't sit right with him from the first walkthrough. The blood pattern on the bedroom wall was the detail that caught his attention immediately. It wasn't scattered the way a chaotic, mutual struggle tends to leave a room. It descended in a controlled, consistent line. The kind of pattern that forms when someone is standing over a person already on the ground, repeating the same motion, rather than 2 people grappling and moving unpredictably through a fight. Grice didn't say it outright that morning, but the instinct was already forming. This didn't look like self-defense. It looked deliberate. He wasn't alone in that read. Detectives Wanda Thompson and Michael Hurd, the lead investigators assigned to the case, walked the same rooms and reached similar conclusions independently of him. A third detective, B. Smith, sat down with Thomas Martins for his voluntary interview hours after the killing, and noted something specific about his demeanor. Thomas spoke with the precision of someone who understood exactly what investigators needed to hear to believe a self-defense claim. He'd spent 30 years working as a federal agent. He knew the language of fear, of imminent threat, of reasonable force, and he used that language from the very first interview, almost like a script he'd rehearsed without ever writing it down. Detectives didn't stop at the scene. They pulled search warrants for phone and financial records belonging to Thomas, Sharon, Molly, and Jason. Building that timeline took weeks of cross-referencing call logs against bank statements, insurance documents, and legal correspondence going back years. What came back didn't favor the story they'd been told. The unanswered calls in the hours before the killing, the sudden shift in dinner plans, a $600,000 life insurance policy with Molly listed as the beneficiary, custody consultations dating back to 2013, well before any divorce was ever filed. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, it gave the case a shape, motive, opportunity, and a financial incentive that existed on paper long before anyone died. Then came a development that rarely gets mentioned outside of court filings. An anonymous call to the detective unit. Someone with knowledge of the family. Possibly someone close to them. Possibly someone who had simply heard enough. Contacted investigators directly and pointed them toward specific inconsistencies in the Martins family's account. Details that hadn't yet surfaced in the official interviews. Tips like that rarely make it into the popular retelling of a case like this. But according to detectives who worked it, this one meaningfully shaped where the investigation went next, narrowing their focus at a point where the case could easily have stalled. The most damaging evidence, though, came from the autopsy. Dr. Craig Nelson, an associate pathologist with the state medical examiner's office, conducted the post-mortem examination on Jason Corbett. He testified that Jason had been struck in roughly 10 distinct areas of the head, with 2 further areas showing signs of repeated blows. He couldn't say with certainty exactly how many times Jason was struck, or how quickly the blows came. He also noted bruising and scraping elsewhere on the body, including the thigh, the hand, and the back. Toxicology added another layer. Jason's system showed trace levels of trazodone, a sedative typically prescribed to help with sleep. Jason had never been prescribed it. Records showed Molly had been issued a 15-milligram prescription for it just 3 days before Jason died, after telling a nurse practitioner she was having trouble sleeping. The level found in Jason's body was reportedly low, and prosecutors were careful at trial not to claim more than the evidence could support. But the question it raised was a simple one. How did a sedative prescribed to Molly end up in her husband's system at all, 3 days after she filled it? No single piece of evidence on its own proved what happened inside that bedroom, but laid side by side, the blood pattern, the financial motive, the composed and rehearsed-sounding 911 call, and an unexplained sedative in a dead man's bloodstream, they formed a version of events that looked nothing like the one Thomas and Molly had given police. This is the case detectives built over the following months. Whether a jury would accept it was an entirely different question. Jury selection began in July of 2017 in Lexington, North Carolina, with Judge David Lee presiding over Davidson County Superior Court. Molly Corbett and Thomas Martins both pleaded not guilty. District Attorney Alan Martin built the prosecution's case around one central argument. A baseball bat and a paving brick are not the tools of a sudden, panicked struggle. They're not the kind of objects people reach for in the middle of a chaotic fight for their lives. Martin argued they were closer to chosen weapons than improvised ones. Items that had no ordinary reason to be within arm's reach of a bedroom, unless someone intended to use them. He laid out the financial motive alongside it for the jury. Methodically, the life insurance policy, the custody consultations filed years before any divorce, the legal groundwork that existed on paper long before a single blow was struck. His argument wasn't that the killing was spontaneous rage. It was that the conditions for it had been building for years. The defense, led by Walter Holton for Molly and David Friedman for Thomas, pushed back hard on that framing. They argued Jason had a darker side few outsiders ever saw, and brought multiple witnesses to the stand who described a pattern of frightening, controlling behavior they said they'd personally observed inside the marriage. Friedman leaned heavily on Thomas's account that he believed, in that moment, his daughter's life was genuinely in danger. That 30 years of law enforcement experience didn't change the fact that he was a father, reacting to what he thought he was seeing. Holton argued the physical evidence had gaps the prosecution couldn't close, pointing out that not every blood sample collected at the scene had been tested. For days, the case came down to which version the jury found more credible: the planned act prosecutors described, or the desperate one the defense argued for. On August 9, 2017, the jury returned its verdict. Both Molly Corbett and Thomas Martins were found guilty of second-degree murder. Judge Lee sentenced each of them to between 20 and 25 years in prison. Jury foreman Tom Amund later told reporters the panel had been unanimous on Thomas almost immediately. Molly's verdict took longer to reach, with the jury initially split, before a careful review of the physical evidence brought them to a unanimous decision as well. Another juror, identified only as Eamon, put it plainly afterward: there were no winners in this case. Everybody lost. Nobody in that room felt any joy in the verdict they'd just delivered. For Jason Corbett's family, watching from the gallery, it looked like an ending. The man who killed their brother, and the woman who stood beside him doing the same, were going to prison for decades. The case that had consumed years of their lives finally had a resolution that matched the severity of what had happened. It would not stay that way for long. In 2020, the North Carolina Court of Appeals overturned both convictions. The reasoning centered on Jack and Sarah Corbett, who were 11 and 8 years old when their father died. In the days after the killing, the children had given statements to a social worker describing arguments and tension they'd witnessed inside the home. At trial, the judge ruled those statements couldn't be presented to the jury. The defense argued that exclusion meant Molly and Thomas never got a fair chance to make their case, and the appeals court agreed. In 2021, North Carolina's Supreme Court upheld that decision by a single vote, 4-3. On paper, the ruling was about a child's right to be heard. In practice, it reopened a case that had felt closed for 3 years. Here's what the ruling didn't account for, and what almost no coverage of this case gives proper weight to. By the time these appeals worked their way through the courts, Jack and Sarah weren't children anymore. They were old enough to describe, in their own words, what had actually happened around those original statements. And what they described was that the version recorded as children didn't reflect their own experience so much as it reflected what they'd been guided to say in the aftermath of losing their father. A retrial was scheduled to give both sides another chance to argue the case in full. It never reached a jury. Sit with what that actually means. A legal system reversed a murder conviction in the name of protecting 2 children's voices. What it ended up protecting, by the children's own later account, was a version of those voices that was never fully theirs in the first place. That's not a footnote in this case. That's arguably the most important turn in the entire 8 years it took to resolve. Most coverage of this story rushes past this part to get to the plea deal and the release. If you want the cases that actually deserve this kind of depth, instead of the version that skips straight to the ending, subscribe. This channel exists specifically for the parts other coverage leaves out. For now, the legal process had been reset. What came next would decide, finally, how this case would end. In October of 2023, with a retrial scheduled and neither side certain how a new jury would rule, Molly Corbett and Thomas Martins accepted a plea deal. Thomas pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. Molly pleaded no contest to the same charge. The second-degree murder charges were dropped. Judge David Hall sentenced each of them to a minimum of 4 years and 3 months, with a maximum of 6 years and 2 months. Because they'd already served 3 years and 8 months following their original 2017 conviction, the time left to serve came down to a matter of months. On June 6, 2024, both walked out of prison. Their parole period ran for 1 year. Court records show neither came to the attention of authorities during that time. On June 6, 2025, their parole was officially closed out. As of now, both Molly Corbett and Thomas Martins live with no remaining legal conditions of any kind. Here's what that means in plain terms. A man died from repeated, severe blunt force trauma in his own bedroom. The two people who admitted hitting him spent roughly 4 years behind bars combined, across both the original sentence and the plea deal that replaced it. 4 years, against a death that ended a 39-year-old father's life and reshaped his children's childhood entirely. That's not a twist. That's not a dramatic reveal. That's simply what the legal record shows, as of today. In recent years, both Molly and Thomas have spoken publicly again about that night, alongside Jason's now adult children. And in those more recent accounts, one detail has surfaced that deserves more attention than it's gotten. Alan Martin, the prosecutor who built the original case, has pointed to a theory that never got wide attention at the time. He suggests Molly may have deliberately engineered a domestic incident that night, specifically to apply for an emergency protective order, using her own parents as built-in witnesses, as a way to secure emergency custody of Jack and Sarah before Jason could act on his own plans to return to Ireland with them. That theory was never tested in front of a jury. The plea deal that ended this case meant it never had to be. It remains, to this day, a theory, not a finding of fact. But it's a theory built by the person who worked this case from the inside. And it fits the evidence laid out earlier in this story more cleanly than the version Molly and Thomas gave police that night. Jack and Sarah Corbett are grown now, raised since 2015 by their aunt, Tracy Corbett Lynch, and her husband David in Ireland. Both now carry the surname Corbett Lynch. So we return to where this started. A man dead, a self-defense claim. Not one mark on either of the people who told it. The evidence built a different story than the one the law ultimately settled for. If cases like this one are what you came here for, hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.